The wind howled through the canyon like a dying animal, rattling the shutters of the small log cabin perched on the mountainside. Clara Whitmore pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and added another log to the fire. Watching the flames dance against the stone hearth she and Elias had built together just 2 summers past. Outside, the Wyoming winter of 1882 showed no mercy. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, adding to the already thick blanket that surrounded her small refuge. The drifts reached nearly to the cabin's windows now, creating walls of white that seemed to press in from all sides. Clara had grown accustomed to the isolation, to the way the wind sang mournful songs through the pine boughs, to the sharp crack of tree limbs breaking under the weight of ice that echoed through the mountains like gunshots. She moved to the window and scraped frost from the glass with her fingernail, peering out into the endless expanse of white. Somewhere out there, beneath all that snow, lay the life she had once known, the life before Elias, the life before love had found her in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected man, Elias Redhawk. Even thinking his name brought both warmth and ache to her chest. He had been unlike any man she had ever known, half Cherokee, half Irish, with eyes the color of river stones and hands that could gentle a wild horse or build a home from nothing but timber and determination. He had found her 3 years ago, lost and fleeing from a town that had grown too small for her spirit, too judgmental for her dreams. Clara remembered that first meeting as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. She had been wandering the mountain trails, her horse lame and her supplies running low, when he emerged from the trees like something out of a story. At first, she had been afraid. A young white woman alone with a man of mixed blood was a scandal that could ruin reputations and end lives. But Elias had simply offered her water from his canteen and asked if she needed help with her horse. "I don't bite, miss," he had said, his voice carrying just a hint of an Irish lilt inherited from his father. "Though I understand if you've been told otherwise." That gentle teasing, devoid of bitterness despite what the world had surely done to him, had been the beginning of everything. He had led her to this very cabin, a place he had built with his own hands in a hidden valley where few white settlers ventured. What was meant to be a single night's shelter had stretched into days, then weeks, then months. Clara had discovered in Elias a kindness she had never known, a strength that didn't need to prove itself through violence or loud words. The people in the nearest settlement, Bitter Creek, had eventually learned of their arrangement. The whispers followed Clara whenever she rode into town for supplies, harsh words spoken behind hands, eyes that looked through her as if she had become invisible, former friends who crossed the street to avoid her. A white woman living openly with a half-breed was bad enough. That she seemed happy about it was unforgivable. "Let them talk," Elias had said when she came home in tears after a particularly cruel day in town. "Their small minds can't change what we have." And what they had was something Clara had never believed possible. Love that asked for nothing but gave everything. Nights spent talking by firelight about books and dreams and the world beyond the mountains. Days working side by side, building a life that belonged to no one but them. Elias taught her to track deer through the forest, to read the sky for weather changes, to find her way by the stars. She taught him to read books she had brought from her old life, shared stories of cities he had never seen, sang songs her mother had taught her before consumption took her when Clara was barely 16. But the happiness couldn't last. It never did for people like them. The hunting trip had been Elias's idea. Winter was coming early that year, and their stores of meat were running low. He had kissed her goodbye that October morning, his lips warm against her cheek, promising to return within 3 days with enough venison to see them through the cold months. "Don't go into town while I'm gone," he had warned, as he always did. "Some of the men have been drinking more lately, talking harder. Wait for me." 3 days had stretched into a week, then 2 weeks. Clara had grown frantic, saddling her horse despite the snow and searching every trail she knew. It was a trapper heading south for the winter who finally brought word. He had found signs of a struggle near Bear Creek, 20 miles north. Blood on the rocks, tracks that might have been a bear, might have been something else, and hanging from a tree branch, torn and stained with blood, Elias's distinctive leather coat, the one his Cherokee grandmother had made for him, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of his ancestors. No body was ever found. Clara had ridden to the spot herself, despite the trapper's warnings about the weather. She found the coat, just as he had described, along with scattered supplies and clear signs of violence. Whether it had been a bear attack or something more sinister, men from town who had grown tired of turning blind eyes to their unconventional arrangement, she would never know for certain. She had taken the coat home and hidden it away, too precious and too painful to look at, but too meaningful to destroy. Through the long winter months that followed, she had lived on the supplies they had stored, on the rabbits she could trap, on the determination to survive that Elias had taught her. The people of Bitter Creek assumed she would return to civilization once the snow melted, would go back east where she belonged and leave behind this chapter of her life like a shameful secret. But Clara couldn't return. Where would she go? How could she explain the woman she had become in these mountains, the love she had known, the loss that had hollowed her out and rebuilt her stronger? So she had stayed, season after season, living like a ghost in the life she and Elias had created. The cabin felt both too empty and too full of memories. Some nights she heard his voice in the wind, felt his presence so strongly that she would turn, expecting to see him warming his hands by the fire. Other nights, the silence was so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums until she thought she might scream. Tonight was one of the silent nights. Clara moved away from the window and picked up her mending, trying to focus on the practical task of patching a tear in her woolen stockings. But her hands shook slightly, and she had to set the work aside. The dreams had been worse lately, not the gentle memories of Elias, but darker visions, dreams where he called to her from the forest, where she followed his voice deeper and deeper into the trees until she was lost, until the cold crept into her bones and she couldn't find her way home. She stood and walked to the corner where they had built a small storage chest, with trembling fingers. She lifted the lid and pushed aside blankets and spare clothes until she found what she was looking for. The leather coat, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, still carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke that had always clung to Elias's skin. Clara lifted it from the chest and held it against her chest, closing her eyes. For a moment, she could almost pretend he was there with her, that his arms were around her instead of this cold remnant of the life they had shared. A sudden gust of wind struck the cabin, rattling the door in its frame and sending a shower of snow down the chimney to hiss against the burning logs. Clara carefully folded the coat and returned it to its hiding place. Outside, the storm was growing worse, the wind picking up to a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of her small sanctuary. She banked the fire for the night and made her way to the narrow bed in the cabin's single room, pulling extra blankets around her as the cold crept through the gaps in the log walls. Tomorrow she would need to check her snares, chop more wood, perhaps brave the storm to reach the small root cellar where she stored her winter vegetables. Tomorrow she would continue surviving, day by day, breath by breath, just as Elias had taught her. But tonight, as the wind screamed through the canyon and snow piled deeper against her door, Clara Whitmore closed her eyes and tried not to think about how easy it would be to simply stop fighting the cold, stop fighting the loneliness, stop fighting the world that had taken everything from her and left her with nothing but memories and regrets. The pounding came just past midnight, so violent and urgent that Clara bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. At first, she thought it might be a tree branch blown against the door by the wind. But then it came again, 3 deliberate strikes that could only be human. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for the rifle Elias had taught her to use, checking to ensure it was loaded before creeping toward the door. In 3 years of solitude, no one had ever come to the cabin at night. Few people even knew of its existence, hidden as it was in this remote valley. "Who's there?" she called through the thick wooden door, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. No answer came, but she heard something that made her blood run cold. A low groan, unmistakably human, followed by what sounded like a body collapsing against the door. Clara's mind raced. It could be a trap, some cruel game devised by the men from Bitter Creek who had never forgotten about the white woman who had lived openly with a half-breed. But the groan had sounded genuinely pained, desperate. She pressed her ear to the door and heard labored breathing, the kind that comes from someone fighting to stay conscious, against every instinct for self-preservation. Clara slowly lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it open just wide enough to peer outside. A man collapsed across her threshold, his body hitting the cabin floor with a sickening thud. Snow swirled around him, and in the flickering light from her fireplace, Clara could see blood seeping through his clothes. But what made her gasp, what made her drop the rifle with a clatter, was what he wore. Elias's coat. The distinctive leather jacket with its intricate Cherokee beadwork was unmistakable, even stained with blood and torn in places she didn't remember. Clara stood frozen, staring down at the unconscious stranger who had somehow come to possess the most precious remnant of her dead lover. The wind drove snow through the open door, and the fire flickered dangerously. Clara forced herself to move, dragging the heavy door closed and barring it again before kneeling beside the fallen man. He was tall, lean, with dark hair plastered to his skull by melted snow and several days' worth of beard covering his jaw. Blood seeped from a wound on his left leg, and his breathing was shallow but steady. Clara had seen enough injuries during her years with Elias to recognize that this man would die if left untreated in the cold. But the sight of that coat, Elias's coat, filled her with such a mixture of rage and anguish that she could barely think straight. "How do you have this?" she whispered to the unconscious man, her fingers hovering over the familiar leather. "Where did you get it?" The man stirred at the sound of her voice, his eyelids fluttering. Clara quickly moved away, grabbing her rifle again and pointing it at him as his eyes opened, pale blue, the color of winter sky. He blinked several times, trying to focus, then attempted to sit up. Pain shot across his features, and he fell back with a grunt. "Don't move," Clara commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell me who you are and how you came by that coat." The man's eyes found hers, and she saw confusion there, along with exhaustion and pain. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. "I mean you no harm. I was lost in the storm. Saw your light." "The coat," Clara interrupted. "Where did you get it?" He looked down at himself as if seeing the leather jacket for the first time, then back at her. "Found it," he said simply. "Few days back, north of here. There was a man. What was left of him after the bears got through." Clara's breath caught. "What man?" "Indian fellow, I'd guess. Dark hair, tall build. Looked like he'd been dead some time. Maybe since autumn. The coat was caught on a tree branch nearby, and He winced as he tried to shift position. "I needed something warm. Didn't think he'd mind, seeing as he had no use for it anymore." The rifle wavered in Clara's hands. She wanted to scream, to rage at this stranger for his casual description of Elias's death, for the matter-of-fact way he spoke of taking clothes from a corpse. But she also heard something in his voice, not cruelty, but the hard pragmatism of someone who understood survival in the wilderness. "You saw him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You saw the body?" The man nodded slowly. "Bears had been at him, but there was enough left to see he'd been a strong man. Young, maybe 30 or so. Had a small leather pouch with him. Had the initials EAR carved into it. Elias Redhawk." Clara felt the rifle slip from her numb fingers as the confirmation she had both dreaded and needed washed over her. He was truly gone. Had been gone all along. The faint hope she had carried through 2 winters, that perhaps he had been injured somewhere, unable to return, but still alive, died in that moment. The stranger was studying her face with those pale blue eyes. "You knew him," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara couldn't speak, couldn't move. The man she had loved, whose memory she had treasured, whose coat she had hidden away like a sacred relic, had been lying dead in the forest while she waited for him to come home. "Ma'am?" The stranger's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Ma'am, I'm bleeding pretty bad here. If you could spare some bandages." Clara shook herself back to the present. Whatever her feelings about this man wearing Elias's coat, he would die if she didn't help him. And despite everything, she couldn't watch another person die in these mountains. She retrieved her medical supplies, strips of clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds, needle and thread, and knelt beside him again. "What's your name?" she asked as she began cutting away the bloodied fabric of his pants leg. "Jonas," he said, gritting his teeth as she examined the wound. "Jonas Mercer." "Well, Jonas Mercer, you're lucky. The cut is deep but clean. Looks like you caught it on something sharp, a branch or rock." Clara poured whiskey over the wound, and Jonas hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out. "How long have you been walking in the storm?" "2 days, maybe 3. Lost my horse when she spooked at something in the trees. Been on foot since then." Jonas watched Clara work, noting the steady skill of her hands. "You've done this before." "Often enough." Clara focused on her task, trying not to think about how many times she had tended Elias's small injuries, how his larger hands had looked against her pale fingers. "What brings you to this part of Wyoming in the middle of winter?" Jonas was quiet for so long that Clara looked up to see if he had lost consciousness again. But his eyes were alert, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Running," he said finally. "Same as most folks who end up in places like this, I'd guess." Clara began stitching the wound closed, her movements efficient despite the tremor in her hands. "Running from what?" "The past." Jonas's jaw tightened as the needle pulled through his skin. "You?" Clara tied off the last stitch and began wrapping the wound with clean cloth. "The present," she said without looking at him. They fell into silence after that, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Clara helped Jonas move to the narrow bench near the hearth, then busied herself cleaning up the medical supplies. She could feel his eyes on her, taking in details of the cabin, the single bed, the spare furnishings, the absence of any masculine belongings save for the few tools and books that had belonged to Elias. "You live here alone," Jonas observed. "Yes, that's dangerous for a woman, especially way out here." Clara finally looked at him directly. "I can take care of myself." Jonas nodded slowly. "I can see that, but it's still dangerous. Everything's dangerous. Mr. Mercer, living is dangerous. The only safe people are dead people." Something in her tone made Jonas study her more carefully. He took in the proud set of her shoulders, the way she held herself with careful control, the sadness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from the fire. "The man whose coat this was," he said quietly. "He lived here with you." It wasn't a question, and Clara didn't treat it like one. She turned away, adding another log to the fire with more force than necessary. "That's none of your concern." "No, ma'am, it's not. But if I'm wearing a dead man's clothes in the house where he lived, seems like I ought to know something about the situation I've wandered into." Clara whirled around, her eyes blazing. "The situation you've wandered into is that you're alive when you should be dead, warm when you should be frozen, and bandaged when you should be bleeding to death in a snowbank. That's the only situation you need to concern yourself with." Jonas held up his hands in surrender. "You're right. I apologize. I owe you my life, and I've got no business asking personal questions." The fight went out of Clara as quickly as it had come. She sank into the cabin's single chair, suddenly exhausted. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It's just been a long time since I've had company." "How long?" Clara looked at him. This stranger wearing her dead lover's coat. This man who had appeared out of the storm like something from a fever dream. 2 years, she said. 2 years since anyone has set foot in this cabin." Jonas let out a low whistle. "That's a long time to be alone." "I chose it," Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. Had she chosen isolation, or had it simply been the only option left to her? Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and snow began to pile against the windows. Jonas shifted on the bench, testing his injured leg. and winced. "You won't be going anywhere for several days." Clara observed, "Maybe longer, if this storm keeps up." Jonas nodded, accepting this reality with the same pragmatic calm he had shown earlier. "I'm grateful for the shelter. Ma'am, I won't impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." Clara looked at him sitting there in Elias's coat, this unexpected intrusion into the carefully ordered solitude she had built around her grief. She should send him away as soon as the storm cleared, should return to the familiar rhythm of her isolation. But something about his presence, perhaps just the simple fact of another human voice after so much silence, made the prospect of being alone again seem suddenly unbearable. "What's your name?" Jonas asked quietly. Clara hesitated. She had spoken her own name aloud so rarely in the past 2 years that it felt strange on her tongue. "Clara," she said finally. "Clara Whitmore." Jonas nodded as if filing this information away. "Well, Miss Whitmore, I'm obliged to you. I won't forget this kindness." Clara turned back to the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the storm rage outside. Kindness, he called it. But as she stole glances at this stranger wearing the coat of the man she had loved, she wondered if what she had done was kindness or simply the desperate act of a woman who had been alone too long with her ghosts. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping Clara and Jonas together in the small cabin like reluctant conspirators. Clara had given Jonas the single bed while she made do with blankets by the fire, insisting that his injured leg needed proper rest. The arrangement forced an intimacy neither had expected, sharing meals, tending the fire in shifts, existing in the same small space with careful politeness that masked deeper currents of tension. Jonas proved to be a quiet companion, respectful of Clara's need for silence while offering help wherever his wounded leg allowed. He mended a broken shutter latch with tools from Elias's workbench, whittled new pegs to secure loose floorboards, and carved additional wooden bowls from scraps of pine. His hands, Clara noticed, were skilled and sure, marked by calluses that spoke of years working with rope and leather and wood. But it was the coat that dominated every moment between them. Clara found her eyes drawn to it constantly, the familiar pattern of the beadwork, the way it hung on Jonas's broader shoulders, the small tear near the left pocket that she remembered Elias catching on a fence post the previous spring. Each glimpse was like a fresh wound, bringing memories she had carefully buried rushing back to the surface. On the 4th morning, as Jonas sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, Clara could bear it no longer. "Tell me exactly where you found him," she said abruptly, setting down the cornbread she had been kneading with more force than necessary. Jonas looked up, understanding immediately what she meant. "About 20 miles north of here, near a creek that runs down from the high country. There's a stand of dead pines on the eastern bank. Lightning strike. Looked like." Clara nodded. She knew the place. She and Elias had camped there during one of their hunting trips. What else was there, besides him and the coat? Jonas was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Are you sure you want to know all of it?" "I need to know." Jonas set aside his rifle and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. There was a horse nearby, or what was left of one, been dead longer than the man, and scattered around were supplies, a saddle pack, some jerky gone bad, a coffee pot. Bears had been through everything, made a mess of it. Clara's hands clenched into fists. That had been Elias's favorite horse, a sturdy bay mare named Sage that he had trained from a filly. "Anything else?" "There was this," Jonas said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small leather pouch, darkened with age and weather. Like I said, had initials carved in it, E.R. Clara's breath caught as she recognized the medicine bag that had belonged to Elias's Cherokee grandmother. He had never traveled without it, believing it carried protection from the spirits of his ancestors. She reached for it with trembling fingers, and Jonas placed it gently in her palm. The leather was stiff and cold, but she could still smell the faint scent of sage and sweetgrass that had always clung to it. Inside, she knew, would be the small collection of stones, dried herbs, and tiny carved fetishes that Elias had carried as reminders of his heritage. He never would have left this behind, Clara whispered, clutching the pouch to her chest. Never. Not willingly. No. Jonas agreed quietly. I don't reckon he would have. The implications hung heavy between them. If Elias had died with his medicine bag still in his possession, if his horse had died nearby, then he had not simply wandered off and met with an accident. He had been attacked, killed where he stood. Clara felt something inside her chest break open, not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but something deeper and more final. The desperate hope she had carried, the fantasy that perhaps Elias had lost his memory or been taken captive but might still return, crumbled away like ash. I knew, she said, her voice hollow. Deep down, I knew he was gone, but I kept thinking, I kept hoping. Jonas watched as tears began to track down her cheeks, the first he had seen her shed since his arrival. How long were you together? 3 years. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, angry at herself for showing such weakness to a stranger. 3 years, and I thought we'd have a lifetime. What happened to him? Do you think? Clara looked up, meeting Jonas's steady gaze. You really want to know? I asked, didn't I? Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the endless expanse of white. Elias was half Cherokee, half Irish. His father was a trapper who married a Cherokee woman before the removal. When the soldiers came to take her people west, she hid in these mountains instead. Elias was born up here, lived his whole life in these hills. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The people in Bitter Creek tolerated him because he kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. But when I came to live with him, Clara's voice hardened. A white woman taking up with a half-breed was more than some folks could stomach. Jonas was quiet, but she could feel his attention like a weight. There were men in town who made it clear they didn't approve. Samuel Morrison, who runs the general store. He told me more than once that I was disgracing my race. Doc Henley refused to treat a cut on Elias's hand, said he didn't doctor animals, and there was a sheriff's deputy, name of Frank Garrison, who seemed to take personal offense at our arrangement. Any of them the type to do more than talk. Clara turned from the window. Garrison, maybe. He was always looking for excuses to ride out this way, claiming he was checking for rustlers or hunting outlaws. But he'd make comments, say things about how half-breeds needed to remember their place. Jonas nodded slowly. Men like that, sometimes talking ain't enough for them. I begged Elias not to go on that hunting trip. Something felt wrong about it, the way Garrison had been sniffing around, asking questions about when Elias usually went hunting, what routes he took. Clara's voice grew bitter. But Elias said we needed the meat for winter, and he wasn't about to let ignorant men dictate how we lived our lives. Sounds like he was a proud man. Too proud, Clara said, her voice breaking. Too proud for his own good. Jonas reached into his shirt again and pulled out something else, a small silver cross on a chain. This was there too, tangled in some brush nearby. Figured it might have been torn off during whatever happened. Clara stared at the cross, her face going pale. That's not Elias's. He wore his grandmother's medicine bag. Never any Christian symbols. Then it belonged to whoever killed him, Jonas said grimly. Clara took the cross with shaking fingers, studying the cheap silver and the simple design. It was the kind of thing that could be bought in any general store, worn by any number of people. But somehow, holding it felt like holding evidence of murder. Frank Garrison wore a cross like this, she whispered. I remember seeing it when he'd lean over his horse to talk to us. Always wore it outside his shirt, like he wanted people to see how Christian he was. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Jonas watched Clara turn the cross over in her palm, her face cycling through grief, rage, and something harder to define. What will you do with this? He asked finally. Clara closed her fist around the cross. I don't know. What good would it do to accuse a lawman of murder? Who would believe the word of a woman who lived openly with a half-breed against a deputy sheriff? Maybe someone who cared about justice. Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. Justice. Mr. Mercer, justice is what happened to Elias. Justice is what men like Garrison call it when they rid the world of people they think don't belong. Jonas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. You've been carrying this alone for 2 years. That's a heavy burden. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. You could have left these mountains, started over somewhere else. Clara looked at him sharply. And go where? Do what? I have nothing, am nothing, except what I built here with Elias. This cabin, this life. It's all I have left of him. Is it living, though? Or is it just another way of dying? The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She stared at Jonas, this stranger who had wandered out of the storm wearing her dead lover's coat, and felt something crack open inside her chest. How dare you? She whispered. You don't know anything about me, about what I've lost. I know you're alive, Jonas said steadily. I know you saved my life when you could have left me to freeze. I know you've kept this place running, kept yourself fed and warm and safe for 2 years on your own. That takes strength most people don't have. Strength, Clara's voice rose. I've been hiding like a coward. I've let the men who killed Elias walk free while I cower up here in the mountains. Maybe, or maybe you've been surviving until you were strong enough to do something about it. Clara stared at him, seeing something in his pale blue eyes that she hadn't noticed before, a depth of understanding that spoke of his own losses, his own reasons for running. What did you lose? She asked quietly. Jonas was silent for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. My wife and daughter. Fever took them both in the space of a week. Down in Texas, I was away on a cattle drive. Didn't even know they were sick until I came home to find them already buried. Clara felt her anger drain away, replaced by a familiar ache of recognition. How long ago? 3 years this spring. Jonas stared into the fire. I sold everything after that, took to wandering, figured if I kept moving, the grief couldn't catch up to me. Did it work? Jonas looked at her with a sad smile. What do you think? Clara sank into her chair, the fight gone out of her. I used to stand outside in the snow, she said softly. Just stand there in my nightgown, waiting. I thought maybe if I got cold enough, sick enough, I could join him, but I was too much of a coward even for that. Jonas leaned forward, his voice gentle. That's not cowardice. Clara, that's your soul knowing you still have something to live for. Clara looked up at him, this unexpected companion who had brought her both the confirmation of her greatest fear and something she hadn't felt in 2 years. The simple comfort of being understood by another human being. Outside, the wind began to die down, and the snow stopped falling for the first time in days. Clara could see patches of blue sky through the breaking clouds, the first hint that the storm was finally passing. The weather's clearing, she observed. Jonas nodded, testing his injured leg. I should be able to travel in a day or 2. Clara felt a strange pang at the thought of being alone again, of returning to the careful routines of solitude she had built around her grief. Where will you go? Don't rightly know. West, maybe, or south, if I can make it over the passes before the next storm. Clara fingered the cross in her palm, feeling its sharp edges bite into her skin. Take me with you, she said suddenly. Jonas looked up, surprised. What? When you go, take me with you. Clara's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape. I can't stay here anymore. I thought I could, but I can't. Not now that I know for certain what happened to him. Clara, I mean it. I have a horse, supplies. I can take care of myself on the trail, and I won't slow you down. She stood, pacing to the window and back. There's nothing left for me here. Nothing but ghosts and memories. Jonas watched her carefully. What about justice? What about the men who killed Elias? Clara stopped pacing and looked at him. What about them? I'm one woman with no proof except a cross that could belong to anyone, even if I could prove Garrison killed Elias. What then? He's a lawman. I'm just the disgraced woman who lived with a half-breed. So you'll just run away? Clara met his gaze steadily. Sometimes running away is the bravest thing you can do. Sometimes it's the only way to survive. Jonas was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing her words, considering her request. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "When I'm well enough to travel, if you still want to go, I'll take you wherever you want to head." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in 2 years, she had a future that extended beyond the next day, the next storm, the next long night alone with her memories. "Thank you," she said simply. Jonas stood, testing his weight on his injured leg. "Don't thank me yet. The trail's hard in winter, and I'm not sure what we'll find at the end of it." Clara looked around the cabin one last time, at the bed she had shared with Elias, the books they had read together, the life they had built in this remote corner of the world. It would all be here when the snow melted, waiting for someone else to claim it, or for the mountains to slowly reclaim it themselves. "I know," she said, "but anything is better than staying here and dying by inches." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, sending shafts of golden light across the snow-covered valley. Clara watched the light dance across the drifts and felt, for the first time since Elias's death, something that might have been hope. The weather turned colder as February deepened, bringing fresh snowfall that buried the cabin under drifts that reached nearly to the roof. What had begun as a temporary arrangement, Jonas healing from his injury while waiting for traveling weather, stretched into weeks of enforced intimacy that neither Clara nor Jonas had anticipated. The cabin's meager stores, meant to sustain one person through the winter, began to run dangerously low. Clara had been careful with her provisions, but feeding 2 people proved a greater strain than she had calculated. The salt pork was nearly gone, the cornmeal reduced to a few precious cups, and the root vegetables in the small cellar were showing signs of rot. "We'll have to hunt," Jonas announced one morning, testing his leg by walking the length of the cabin. The wound had healed well under Clara's care, leaving only a slight stiffness that he worked to overcome with daily exercise. Clara looked up from the thin soup she was stirring, mostly broth and the last of their winter onions. "The snow's too deep, and there isn't much game this high up in winter. There are rabbit trails I've seen from the window, and deer will come down from the high country when they get desperate enough." Jonas reached for his rifle, checking the action. "I've hunted in worse conditions." Clara hesitated. The thought of Jonas leaving the cabin, even for a few hours, filled her with unexpected anxiety. Over the past weeks, she had grown accustomed to his presence in ways that surprised her. The steady sound of his breathing at night, the quiet competence with which he maintained the fire, the simple comfort of another human voice breaking the mountain silence. "I'll come with you," she said. Jonas looked up, surprised. "Clara, the snow's waist-deep in places, and if we do find game, tracking it could take us far from the cabin. Elias taught me to track," Clara said, reaching for her own rifle, a lighter weapon that Elias had modified specifically for her smaller hands. "And I know this country better than you do." Jonas studied her face, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. "All right, but we go together, and we don't separate. These mountains are unforgiving, especially in winter." They set out just after dawn, moving slowly through snow that crunched and squeaked under their snowshoes. A pair Elias had made for Clara, and another set Jonas had fashioned from bent wood and leather strips during his convalescence. The air was so cold it burned their lungs, and their breath hung in white clouds that froze on their scarves and coat collars. Clara led the way toward a series of ravines where she and Elias had often found game. The familiar landmarks, a lightning-struck pine, a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, brought back memories that were both painful and strangely comforting. For the first time since his death, she felt Elias's presence as something other than loss, as if his knowledge and skills lived on in the lessons he had taught her. They found rabbit tracks first, the distinctive pattern of prints that marked where the animals had bounded through the snow in search of bark and winter berries. Jonas proved to be as skilled a hunter as Clara had hoped, reading the signs with the same quiet competence Elias had shown. "There," he whispered, pointing to a thicket of brush where they could see the dark shapes of rabbits foraging. 2 of them, maybe 3. Clara raised her rifle, sighting carefully on the largest rabbit. The shot echoed through the canyon, sharp and clean, and the rabbit dropped without a sound. The others scattered, but Jonas's second shot brought down another before they disappeared into the undergrowth. "Good shooting," Jonas said, and Clara felt a flush of pride that surprised her. It had been 2 years since anyone had witnessed her skills, acknowledged her competence. They dressed the rabbits quickly in the cold air, then continued deeper into the mountains in search of larger game. The exercise felt good to Clara, the burn of exertion in her legs, the sharp awareness that came from moving through dangerous country, the sense of purpose that hunting required. Near midday, they found deer sign, tracks and droppings that were fresh enough to follow. The trail led them up a steep-sided ravine where the snow was thinner, protected by overhanging rocks. Clara felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the area. "We're getting close to where you found him," she said quietly. Jonas nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. "We can turn back if you want." Clara shook her head. "No, I need to see it." They climbed higher, following the deer trail and Clara's memory both. When they crested a small ridge, Clara saw the stand of lightning-struck pines Jonas had described, their black skeletons stark against the white snow. The creek was frozen solid, its surface marked by wind-blown patterns that looked like writing in a language Clara couldn't read. "There," Jonas said softly, pointing to a cluster of boulders near the creek bank. "That's where I found him." Clara approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The snow had covered any trace of what had happened here, but she could picture it. Elias making camp for the night, perhaps watering his horse at the creek, unaware that death was approaching through the trees. "Was he armed?" she asked. Jonas nodded. "Had his rifle with him, and a pistol. Neither had been fired." Clara knelt in the snow, placing her gloved hand on the ground where Elias had died. He was careful, always watching, for someone to get close enough to kill him without him drawing a weapon. She looked up at Jonas. He must have known them, must have trusted them enough to let them approach. Or they shot him from a distance. Clara shook her head. "You said there was a struggle, blood on the rocks, and no man could make that shot in failing light from far enough away to avoid being seen." Jonas was quiet, letting her work through the logic of it. Clara stood and walked a slow circle around the area, trying to read the story the ground might tell if it weren't buried under 2 feet of snow. "He would have made camp over there," she said, pointing to a sheltered spot between 2 large boulders. "Out of the wind, but where he could see anyone approaching. The horse would have been hobbled near the creek, close enough to water but within sight." She paused, picturing the scene. Someone rode up openly, someone he recognized. They talked, maybe shared coffee. Then, Clara's voice trailed off. "Then they killed him." Jonas finished quietly. Clara nodded, feeling a cold anger settle in her chest. Not the wild grief she had carried for 2 years, but something harder and more focused. Frank Garrison. It had to be. He knew these mountains, knew Elias's hunting patterns. And Elias might have trusted him enough to let him approach, especially if Garrison claimed to be on official business. They were interrupted by the sound Jonas had been listening for, the soft step of deer moving through the snow. 3 animals picked their way carefully down the slope toward the frozen creek. A doe and 2 smaller deer, their brown coats dark against the white landscape. Jonas and Clara moved into position without speaking, their partnership falling into the natural rhythm that comes from shared purpose. Jonas took the larger shot while Clara aimed for one of the smaller deer. Both rifles fired within seconds of each other, the sounds echoing off the canyon walls. Both deer fell cleanly. The third bounded away, disappearing into the trees with the quick, liquid grace that had kept its species alive in this harsh country for thousands of years. "That'll keep us fed for a while," Jonas said with satisfaction as they approached their kill. Clara nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Being here, in the place where Elias had died, had crystallized something in her thinking. The rage she felt wasn't the kind that burned itself out quickly. It was the slow, patient anger that could sustain itself over time. They spent the rest of the afternoon butchering the deer and preparing to transport the meat back to the cabin. It was heavy work, made harder by the cold and the deep snow, but Clara found herself grateful for the physical demands. Action felt better than the passive waiting she had endured for so long. As they prepared to head home, Jonas touched her shoulder. "Clara, what you're thinking, about Garrison, about justice. Be careful. Men like that, they don't fight fair." Clara looked back at the place where Elias had died, then at Jonas. "Neither do I. Not anymore." The return journey to the cabin took most of the remaining daylight, both of them loaded down with meat and moving slowly through the deep snow. By the time they reached home, Clara was exhausted but felt more alive than she had in months. The successful hunt, the physical exertion, even the painful visit to the place of Elias's death had awakened something in her that had been sleeping too long. They spent the evening processing the meat, cutting it into strips for jerky and portioning it for immediate use. The cabin filled with the rich smell of cooking venison, and for the first time in weeks, they ate until they were truly full. "We could stay here through the spring," Jonas said as they settled by the fire afterward. "With this much meat, we'd be comfortable until the weather clears for good." Clara looked at him across the firelight, noting the way the flames highlighted the strong bones of his face, the steady patience in his eyes. Over the weeks they had spent together, she had grown to appreciate his quiet competence, his lack of judgment about her unconventional past, the way he listened without trying to fix or change her. "Is that what you want?" she asked. Jonas was quiet for a moment. "I want whatever keeps you safe," he said finally. The words hung between them, heavier than either had intended. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Jonas," she said softly. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know," he said. "I know you're still grieving him. I know you may never stop. I'm not asking for anything you can't give." Clara studied his face in the firelight, seeing the loneliness there that matched her own, the careful hope he was trying not to show. "What are you asking for?" Jonas reached for another piece of wood, adding it to the fire with deliberate concentration. "Just to be here, just to be whatever you need me to be, for as long as you need it." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not the bitter tears of grief she had shed so often, but something warmer and more complicated. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be with someone else, how to trust again." "Neither do I," Jonas said simply. "Maybe we can figure it out together." Clara looked around the cabin, at the bed where she had slept alone for 2 years, at the chair where Elias used to read to her in the evenings, at the life she had built around the memory of a dead man. Then she looked back at Jonas, this unexpected companion who had brought her both closure and the possibility of something new. "The spring," she said finally. "We'll decide in the spring." Jonas nodded, understanding. The spring. Outside, the wind picked up again, promising more snow. But inside the cabin, warmed by firelight and the knowledge that they would face whatever came together, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Elias's death, the simple comfort of not being alone. She watched Jonas bank the fire for the night, noting the careful way he arranged the logs, the quiet efficiency of his movements. When he looked up and caught her watching, she didn't look away. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Clara gestured around the cabin, taking in the stored meat, the mended furniture, the sense of life and purpose that had returned to the small space. "For reminding me that surviving and living aren't the same thing." Jonas smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. "You did that yourself, Clara. I just happened to be here to see it." As they settled into their respective sleeping areas, Jonas on the narrow bench by the fire, Clara in the bed that no longer felt quite so empty, Clara found herself listening to the sound of another person breathing in the darkness. For the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel like a weight pressing down on her chest. Instead, it felt like possibility. The morning after their successful hunt dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of winter day that made the air ring like crystal when broken by sound. Clara woke to find Jonas already up, feeding fresh logs to the fire and setting coffee to brew in the battered pot that had served her through 2 winters of solitude. "Sleep well?" he asked without turning around, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "Better than I have in a long time," Clara admitted, surprised by the truth of it. For the first time since Elias's death, she had slept through the night without the dreams that usually plagued her, visions of him calling to her from the forest, always just out of reach. Jonas handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly as she took it. The contact sent a small shock through her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes that told her he had felt it too. "I've been thinking," Jonas said, settling into the chair across from her. "About what you said yesterday, about Garrison." Clara's attention sharpened. "What about it? If you're right, if he did kill Elias, then staying here might not be as safe as I thought. Men who kill once, especially when they think they've gotten away with it." Jonas paused, choosing his words carefully. "They don't usually stop at once." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. "You think he might come back?" "I think a man like that, he'd want to make sure there were no loose ends. And you, living up here alone, knowing what you know." Jonas met her eyes. "You're a loose end, Clara." The weight of this truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had been so focused on her grief, on simply surviving from one day to the next, that she hadn't fully considered the danger she might still be in. "Then we leave," she said simply. Jonas studied her face. "Are you sure? This is your home, yours and Elias's. Leaving means giving up everything you built together." Clara looked around the cabin, taking in the familiar details, the quilt she and Elias had sewn together during their first winter, the shelves he had built to hold her books, the marks on the door frame where he had measured his height against hers, laughing at how she barely reached his shoulder. "What I built with Elias isn't in these walls," she said finally. "It's in here." She touched her chest, over her heart. "And I can carry that anywhere." Jonas nodded, understanding. "Where do you want to go?" Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. "California. Maybe. I've heard there are places there where a person's past doesn't matter as much, where people are too busy building their own futures to worry about judging others." "California's a long way," Jonas said. "Hard traveling, even when the weather turns. Everything worthwhile is hard." Clara replied, echoing something Elias used to say. They spent the morning making plans, discussing routes and supplies, the practical details of abandoning one life for another. Jonas proved to have extensive knowledge of the Western trails, gained during his years of wandering after his own loss. "We'll need to wait for the worst of the winter to pass," he said, sketching a rough map on a piece of bark with a piece of charcoal. "March, maybe early April. Give us enough time to cross the high passes before the spring storms hit." Clara nodded, then looked at him curiously. "How do you know so much about the trails?" Jonas was quiet for a moment. "After Sarah and Emma died, I spent 3 years trying to outrun the pain. Covered a lot of ground in that time. Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona territory. Never found what I was looking for, though." "What were you looking for?" "Peace, I guess. A way to make sense of losing them." Jonas looked up from his map. "What about you? What are you looking for in California?" Clara considered this. A chance to start over, to be someone other than the grieving woman who lived with a half-breed and caused a scandal. "Is that who you think you are?" The question caught Clara off guard. She had become so accustomed to defining herself by her loss, by the judgment of others, that she hadn't considered whether that definition was true or simply convenient. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been her for so long. I'm not sure who else I might be." Jonas reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "Who?" "You're the woman who saved a stranger's life without asking questions. You're the woman who survived 2 winters alone in country that would kill most men. You're brave and strong and kind. And you're still here despite everything that's tried to break you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the certainty in his voice. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been watching you for weeks now. I've seen how you move through this world, how you carry yourself. Grief hasn't made you bitter. Clara, it's made you deeper." Clara turned her hand over so that their palms pressed together, feeling the calluses on his fingers, the steady warmth of his skin. "Jonas, I need you to understand something. What I felt for Elias—" "I know," Jonas interrupted gently. "I know you loved him. I know you still love him. I'm not asking you to stop." "Then what are you asking?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands. "I'm asking if there might be room in your heart for something different, not instead of what you had, but alongside it." Clara felt something flutter in her chest, not the desperate, consuming love she had felt for Elias, but something steadier, more patient. "I don't know if I know how to love like that." "Neither do I," Jonas admitted. "But maybe we could learn together." Clara looked at his face in the firelight, seeing the hope there that he was trying so hard to contain. Without quite deciding to do it, she leaned forward and kissed him, softly, tentatively, a question more than a statement. Jonas went very still, and for a moment Clara thought she had made a mistake. Then his free hand came up to cup her cheek, and he kissed her back with a gentleness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against his. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I," Jonas replied. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared just means we're brave enough to try." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time since Elias's death, she felt something other than alone. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Clara made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of retiring to the bed while Jonas settled on his makeshift pallet by the fire, she brought her blankets to join him. "Clara," Jonas said softly, uncertainty in his voice. "Just to sleep?" she said quickly. I don't want to be alone tonight." Jonas nodded, understanding. They arranged their blankets side by side, close enough to share warmth, but not quite touching. Clara lay on her back, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling, acutely aware of Jonas beside her. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. "Your wife and daughter." Jonas was silent for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Sarah was barely 18 when we married, but she was the strongest person I ever knew. She could birth a calf, bake bread, and teach Sunday school all in the same day. And Emma." Jonas's voice caught. "Emma had her mother's eyes, but my stubborn streak. She was only 4 when the fever took them, but she could already read simple words, could sit a horse like she'd been born in the saddle." Clara turned on her side to face him. "How do you bear it? The missing them?" Jonas turned to meet her eyes. "Some days better than others. I used to think the pain would kill me, that I'd die from the weight of it. But then I realized something. The pain was proof that what we had was real, was worth something. So I stopped trying to make it go away and started trying to carry it better." Clara reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and touched his face. "I'm sorry you lost them." "I'm sorry you lost him," Jonas replied. They lay like that in the firelight, facing each other across the small space between their blankets. 2 people who had learned that love and loss were inseparable, that the price of caring was the possibility of devastating pain. "Jonas," Clara said softly. When we leave here in the spring, I want to take something of Elias with us. Not the coat. I think it's time to let that go. But his books, maybe the tools he made for me. Something to prove he existed, that what we had mattered." Jonas nodded. "We'll take whatever you want to take." Clara closed her eyes, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't even realized was unsettled. Thank you. For what now? For not asking me to choose, for understanding that loving you doesn't mean forgetting him. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's what love really is, he said finally. Not asking people to be smaller than they are, but making room for all the parts of them, even the broken ones. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. Not tears of grief this time, but something more complex, more hopeful. I think I could learn to love like that. I think we both could. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow skittering across the roof. But inside, warmed by the fire and by the possibility of a future that held both memory and hope, Clara felt safer than she had in 2 years. She fell asleep to the sound of Jonas breathing beside her, and for the first time since Elias's death, she dreamed not of the past but of the future, of trails leading west, of new places where old sorrows might find new meanings, of love that was large enough to hold both what had been lost and what might yet be found. When she woke in the morning, she found Jonas already up, building up the fire and preparing breakfast. But their blankets were closer together than they had been the night before, and she could see the impression in the snow where he had moved closer to her sometime during the night, drawn by the simple human need for warmth and connection. Clara smiled as she watched him work, feeling something she had thought she might never feel again. The quiet contentment that comes from sharing space with someone who understands the weight you carry and doesn't ask you to set it down, but simply offers to help you carry it. It wasn't the consuming passion she had shared with Elias, but it was something equally valuable, the steady promise of companionship, of shared burdens and mutual support, of love that grew from friendship rather than overwhelming attraction. As Clara rose to help Jonas with breakfast, she realized that for the first time in 2 years, she was looking forward to the day ahead. Not just surviving it, but actually living it, with someone who made even the simple act of brewing coffee feel like a shared adventure. Spring seemed very far away, but for the first time, Clara found herself eager for its arrival, not because it would mean escape from the prison of winter, but because it would mean the beginning of whatever came next. The weeks that followed passed in a rhythm that felt almost like contentment. Clara found herself taking notice of small pleasures she had forgotten during her years of solitude. The way Jonas hummed old trail songs while mending gear, the satisfaction of sharing a well-cooked meal, the comfortable silence that could stretch between them without awkwardness. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire after supper, Clara made a decision that had been building in her mind for days. "I want to write it all down," she said suddenly. Jonas looked up from the leather strap he was repairing. "Write what down?" "Everything. About Elias, about what happened to him, about the men in town who made our lives difficult." Clara stood and began pacing, her words coming faster as the idea took shape. "If something happens to me, if Garrison decides I know too much, there should be some record of the truth." Jonas set aside his work. "Clara, that could be dangerous. If the wrong people found such a letter, then they'd know I wasn't planning to stay quiet forever." Clara moved to the small writing desk where she kept Elias's books and her few personal papers. "Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen." She pulled out a sheet of paper and her pen, then paused, looking at Jonas. "Will you help me? You knew Elias, saw where he died. Your word might carry more weight than mine alone." Jonas studied her face, seeing the determination there, the need to transform her grief into action. "What exactly are you planning to do with this letter once it's written?" Clara sat down at the desk, dipping her pen in the small bottle of ink she had carefully rationed through the winter. "I don't know yet, but I know I can't carry this secret anymore. It's eating me alive. Jonas, the knowledge that his killers are walking free while I hide in these mountains like a coward." "You're not a coward," Jonas said firmly. "Then help me prove it." Jonas moved his chair closer to the desk, close enough that Clara could feel the warmth of his shoulder beside hers. "All right, start with the beginning. How you and Elias met, what your life was like together." Clara began to write, her pen scratching across the paper in the firelight. She wrote about finding Elias in the mountains, about the gradual growth of their love despite the world's disapproval. She wrote about the whispered comments in town, the refusal of service, the cold stares that followed her wherever she went. Samuel Morrison at the general store, she wrote, made it clear on multiple occasions that he found my relationship with Elias Redhawk to be an affront to decent Christian folk. Dr. Henley refused medical treatment to Elias, stating that he didn't doctor animals. Jonas read over her shoulder as she wrote, occasionally suggesting additions or corrections. When she reached the part about Frank Garrison, Jonas's jaw tightened. He was more than just disapproving, Jonas said quietly. The way you've described his visits, his questions about Elias's hunting patterns, that wasn't casual prejudice. That was a man planning something. Clara nodded, adding details about Garrison's increasingly frequent visits to the valley. His pointed questions about when Elias would be away from the cabin. His comments about half-breeds needing to know their place. And then there's this, Clara said, reaching for the silver cross that Jonas had found near Elias's body. She held it up to the light, studying the cheap metal and simple design, physical evidence linking a Christian man to the scene of the murder. Jonas took the cross from her, turning it over in his palm. It's not much. Any number of men could own something like this. But how many of them knew Elias's hunting schedule? How many had access to these mountains without raising suspicion? Clara's voice grew harder as she spoke. Frank Garrison wore a cross exactly like this one. I saw it every time he leaned over his saddle to talk to us, making sure we could see how righteous and Christian he was while he planned murder. Clara wrote it all down, her suspicions about Garrison, the evidence of the cross, Jonas's testimony about finding the body and the signs of struggle. When she finished, she had filled 3 pages with a neat, careful handwriting that laid out a case for murder as clearly as any legal document. There, she said, setting down her pen. Let the truth be told, finally. Jonas read through the completed letter, his expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. Clara, this is essentially an accusation of murder against a law officer. If this falls into the wrong hands, then at least someone will know what happened to Elias and why. Clara folded the letter carefully and sealed it with wax from a candle, pressing Elias's signet ring, the only jewelry he had ever worn, into the warm seal. I'm tired of being afraid. Jonas, tired of letting fear make my decisions for me. Jonas watched her seal the letter, seeing the finality in her movements. What do you plan to do with it? Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley where she had spent 3 years building a life with one man and 3 months learning to trust another. When we leave for California, I'm going to leave this letter with someone in Denver, someone who might actually care about justice. A newspaper editor, maybe, or a federal marshal, someone who isn't beholden to the local power structure that protected Garrison. And if nothing comes of it, Clara turned back to face him. Then at least I'll have tried. At least I won't have to live with the knowledge that I let his killers go unpunished without even making an attempt to see justice done. Jonas stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. You know this means we can't ever come back here. Once that letter surfaces, once accusations are made, this whole territory will be too dangerous for you. Clara looked around the cabin one last time, at the bed where she had loved Elias, at the fireplace where they had spent countless evenings reading together, at the life they had built in this remote corner of the world. I know, she said simply. I've known since the night you arrived that this part of my life was ending. Jonas studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before, not just resolution, but a kind of peace. You're ready to let go. I'm ready to carry it differently, Clara corrected. Elias will always be part of me, but I can't build a shrine to him and call it living. That night, Clara made another decision that marked the changing nature of their relationship. After banking the fire and preparing for sleep, she didn't arrange her blankets beside Jonas's makeshift bed as she had been doing. Instead, she stood beside the cabin's single bed and looked at him expectantly. Jonas understood immediately what she was offering, and what she wasn't. Clara, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said quietly. But I want to. Not because I'm trying to replace what I had with Elias, but because I'm ready to have something different with you. Jonas approached slowly, giving her time to change her mind. When he reached her, he cupped her face gently in his hands. Are you sure? Clara answered by kissing him, not with the desperate passion she had once shared with Elias, but with something steadier, more deliberate. It was the kiss of a woman who had thought carefully about her choices and made them with full awareness of their meaning. They came together slowly, carefully. Two people who understood that physical intimacy was just one way of sharing the burden of living, of affirming that they were still capable of connection despite all they had lost. Jonas was gentle with her, patient, understanding that this was as much about trust as it was about desire. Afterward, they lay together in the narrow bed, Clara's head on Jonas's shoulder, listening to the wind outside and the crackling of the dying fire. I need you to understand something, Clara said softly. This doesn't erase him. It doesn't mean I've stopped loving him. Jonas's arm tightened around her. I wouldn't want it to. What you had with Elias. That's part of who you are. I fell in love with all of you, Clara, including the parts that belonged to him. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. Not tears of grief this time, but something more complicated. Relief, maybe, at being understood so completely. Gratitude for finding someone who didn't ask her to be smaller than she was. How did you get so wise about love? She asked. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Losing Sarah and Emma taught me that love isn't something you use up. The more you give away, the more you have. Loving you doesn't dishonor their memory any more than loving me dishonors Elias's. Clara turned in his arms so she could see his face in the dim light from the fireplace. I love you, she said, and realized as she spoke the words that they were true. Not the overwhelming, consuming love she had felt for Elias, but something equally real and perhaps more sustainable. I love you too, Jonas replied, and Clara heard the wonder in his voice, as if he was as surprised as she was to find himself capable of such feeling again. They fell asleep entwined. Two people who had learned that the heart was larger and more resilient than either had imagined. Outside, the wind continued to blow and snow continued to fall. But inside the small cabin, warmed by firelight and by the possibility of shared tomorrows, Clara felt something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. When morning came, Clara woke to find Jonas already up, building the fire and preparing coffee. But this time, instead of the careful distance they had maintained for weeks, he came to the bed and kissed her forehead gently before returning to his tasks. Clara watched him work, noting the easy domesticity of his movements, the way he seemed to belong in this space that had once been hers and Elias's alone. The transition felt natural, unforced, not in replacement of what had been, but an evolution of what could be. She rose and joined him at the small stove, standing close enough that their shoulders touched as she helped prepare breakfast. It was a small gesture, but it marked a fundamental shift in their relationship, from two people sharing space out of necessity to two people choosing to build something together. Spring's coming, Jonas observed, looking out the window at the snow that was finally showing signs of melting around the edges. Clara nodded, following his gaze. A few more weeks, maybe a month, and we can start thinking about leaving. Any regrets? Clara considered this, looking around the cabin that had been her whole world for so long. About leaving? No. About waiting so long to start living again, maybe. Jonas turned from the stove and pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest. We're both living now, he said simply. That's what matters. Clara closed her eyes and let herself be held, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time since Elias's death, she felt truly safe, not just physically protected, but emotionally secure in the knowledge that she was cared for by someone who understood her completely. Outside, the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the lengthening days and the subtle changes in the quality of light. Soon they would leave this place forever, carrying with them nothing but what they could pack on horseback and the memories of what had been built and lost and found again in this remote valley. But for now, in this moment, Clara was content to stand in Jonas's arms and watch the coffee brew, to exist in the simple present tense of shared domestic tasks and mutual affection, to know that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The snow began its retreat in earnest during the first week of March, revealing patches of brown earth and the first tentative signs of returning life. Clara and Jonas had spent weeks preparing for their departure, carefully selecting what could be carried and what would have to be left behind. The cabin that had sheltered Clara through 2 winters of grief would soon stand empty, holding only memories and the ghosts of the life she had built there. On a clear morning when the air held the first genuine warmth of spring, they loaded their horses and prepared to descend from the mountains. Clara had chosen to take only the most essential items: Elias's books, the tools he had made for her, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, and the sealed letter that contained her accusations against Frank Garrison. As they prepared to leave, Clara walked through the cabin one last time, touching surfaces that held memories, saying goodbye to the life she was leaving behind. At the small desk where she'd written the letter, she paused to leave behind something of her own, a brief note explaining that she was leaving willingly, that if anything happened to her on the trail, Jonas Mercer was not to be held responsible. "Ready?" Jonas asked gently, standing in the doorway with the horses. Clara took one last look at the bed where she had loved 2 different men, at the fireplace where she had spent countless evenings reading and dreaming and mourning. Then she nodded and stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind her. The journey down from the mountains took 2 days, following trails that were treacherous with melting snow and spring runoff. Clara's mare picked her way carefully down steep switchbacks, while Jonas's gelding followed, both animals eager to reach lower elevations and better grazing. On the evening of their second day, they made camp in a grove of cottonwoods near a creek swollen with snowmelt. As Jonas tended the horses and Clara prepared their simple meal over a small fire, she found herself thinking about the town they would reach tomorrow, Bitter Creek, the place where she had endured years of whispered comments and cold stares, where the men who had made her life with Elias so difficult still conducted their business and lived their lives. "We could go around," Jonas said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Add a day to our journey and avoid the town entirely." Clara looked up from the beans she was stirring. "No, I need to face them one more time. I need to look Frank Garrison in the eye and let him know that I know what he did." Jonas frowned. "Clara, that could be dangerous. If he realizes you have evidence, then maybe he'll make a mistake. Maybe he'll say something or do something that proves his guilt." Clara's voice was steady, but Jonas could see the tension in her shoulders. "I can't spend the rest of my life running from shadows. Jonas, I need to confront this or it will follow me wherever we go." Jonas studied her face in the firelight, seeing the determination there alongside the fear. "All right, but we do this carefully. We get supplies, conduct our business, and get out. We don't linger, and we don't give anyone time to organize trouble." Clara nodded, understanding, just long enough to let them know I'm not afraid anymore. They reached Bitter Creek just after noon the following day, riding down the main street as if they owned it. Clara sat straight in her saddle, her chin high, refusing to acknowledge the stares and whispered comments that followed their progress through town. She wore her best dress, the blue wool that Elias had always said brought out her eyes, and she had braided her hair in a style that made her look older, more dignified. Jonas rode beside her, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol, his pale eyes scanning the faces they passed. He was dressed like what he was, a man comfortable with violence, someone not to be trifled with. Clara found his presence both reassuring and empowering. Their first stop was the general store, where Samuel Morrison stood behind his counter with the same disapproving expression Clara remembered from her previous visits. Morrison's eyes widened slightly when he saw her, then narrowed as he took in her companion. "Miss Whitmore," Morrison said coldly. "Thought you'd left these parts for good. Just passing through, Mr. Morrison." Clara replied evenly. I need supplies for the trail. Morrison's gaze flicked to Jonas, taking in the man's weathered appearance and the weapons he carried. And who might this be? Jonas Mercer, Jonas said, his voice carrying a subtle warning. Friend of Miss Whitmore's. Clara moved through the store methodically, selecting trail provisions while Morrison watched her every move with obvious suspicion. When she approached the counter with her purchases, Morrison hesitated before beginning to tally her order. That'll be $12, he said finally, naming a price that was at least $3 higher than the goods were worth. Jonas stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. Seems a mite steep for beans and coffee? Morrison's face flushed. Prices have gone up, supply and demand. Clara placed exact change on the counter, the fair price for the goods she had selected. That should cover it, she said calmly. Unless you'd like to explain to the territorial authorities why you're charging different prices to different customers. Morrison stared at the money for a long moment, then swept it into his cash box without another word. As Clara gathered her purchases, he couldn't resist a parting shot. Heard tell you've been living alone up in those mountains, he said with false concern. Must get lonely, woman like you with no proper husband to look after her. Clara met his eyes steadily. I've managed just fine, thank you. Some might even say I've thrived. Outside the store, Jonas loaded their purchases onto the pack horse while Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk, looking up and down the main street of the town that had never accepted her. She saw familiar faces, women who had once been friendly acquaintances before her relationship with Elias made her a scandal. Men who had worked with Elias on occasion before deciding that association with him was bad for their reputations. There, Jonas said quietly, nodding toward the sheriff's office across the street. Garrison. Clara turned to see a tall, thin man in a deputy's badge emerging from the building. Frank Garrison looked older than she remembered, his face more lined, but she recognized the arrogant set of his shoulders, the way he surveyed the street as if he owned everything in sight. Garrison's eyes found hers across the dusty expanse of the main street, and Clara saw recognition flicker in his expression, followed quickly by something that might have been alarm. He started toward them, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was probably unconscious, but unmistakably threatening. Miss Whitmore, Garrison said as he approached, his voice carrying false friendliness. Been a long time? Heard you were living up in the high country. Deputy Garrison? Clara replied, matching his tone. Yes, I've been keeping to myself. Fewer complications that way. Garrison's eyes flicked to Jonas, assessing the threat he represented. And you are? Jonas Mercer, Jonas replied, not offering his hand. I've been keeping Miss Whitmore company through the winter. Something shifted in Garrison's expression. Suspicion, calculation, perhaps a hint of fear. Is that so? Must get mighty lonely up there, especially after what happened to that half-breed fellow she used to keep company with. Clara felt anger flare in her chest but kept her voice level. Elias Redhawk was murdered. Deputy, surely that's a matter that would interest a lawman. Garrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Murder's a strong word. Miss Whitmore. From what I heard, bears got him. Happens to folks who aren't careful in the wilderness. Strange, Jonas interjected quietly. I found his body a few months back. Didn't look like any bear attack I ever saw. Garrison went very still, his attention focusing on Jonas with predatory intensity. You found the body? Jonas nodded. What was left of it? Along with some interesting items that probably belonged to whoever killed him. Clara watched Garrison's face carefully, seeing the moment when the deputy realized they might pose a threat to whatever story he had constructed about Elias's death. His hand moved closer to his gun, and she saw Jonas tense in response. That's very interesting, Garrison said slowly. I'd like to hear more about these items. Perhaps you'd like to come to the office and make a statement. Clara knew a trap when she heard one. I'm afraid we can't stay. Deputy, we're heading west, and we need to cover ground before the weather turns. Garrison's mask of friendliness slipped slightly. Seems to me that information about a murder would take precedence over travel plans. In fact, I might have to insist that you stay until we can get to the bottom of this. The threat was clear. and Clara felt the careful control she had maintained beginning to fray. "Are you detaining us, Deputy? On what charges?" "Suspicion of interfering with a lawful investigation," Garrison said smoothly. "Maybe concealing evidence in a criminal matter." Jonas stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Clara and Garrison. "Mighty strange investigation," he observed. "Seeing as how you seem to think it was a bear attack until we mentioned evidence." Garrison's hand dropped to his gun, but before he could draw, a new voice interrupted the tense standoff. "Frank Garrison, you leave those folks alone." Clara turned to see Reverend William Hayes approaching from the direction of the small white church at the end of the street. Hayes was an older man, one of the few people in Bitter Creek who had never openly disapproved of Clara's relationship with Elias. "Reverend," Garrison said tightly, "this is official business." Hayes positioned himself beside Clara and Jonas, his presence adding moral weight to their position. "Official business that requires drawing a weapon on unarmed travelers? I don't think so. Frank." Clara saw Garrison calculating, weighing his options. With the Reverend as a witness, he couldn't simply arrest them without cause, couldn't make them disappear without questions being asked. "This isn't over," Garrison said quietly, his eyes fixed on Clara. "I'll be keeping an eye on things, making sure justice gets done." Clara met his gaze steadily, letting him see that she wasn't intimidated. "Justice would be a fine thing, Deputy. I'm sure Elias would appreciate it, wherever he is." Garrison's face darkened at the implication, but with Reverend Hayes watching, he could do nothing but step back and let them pass. Clara and Jonas mounted their horses under his baleful stare, gathered their pack animal, and rode slowly out of town. They didn't speak until they were well clear of Bitter Creek, following the main trail west toward the mountain passes. Only when the town had disappeared behind a bend in the road did Clara allow herself to relax. "That was dangerous," Jonas said quietly. "He knows we suspect him, and now he knows we might have evidence." Clara nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to the sealed letter in her saddlebag. "Good. Let him know. Let him worry about what we might do with what we know." Jonas looked at her with something approaching admiration. "You stood up to him, looked him right in the eye, and didn't back down." Clara felt a surge of satisfaction, the first she had experienced in 2 years. "I'm tired of being afraid of small, cruel men. Elias deserved better than to be forgotten, and I deserve better than to spend my life hiding from his killers." As they rode west toward whatever future awaited them, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Elias's death, a sense of completion, of having faced her past and found the courage to move beyond it. Garrison might come after them, might try to silence them, but she was no longer alone and no longer defenseless. Behind them, the mountains that had sheltered her grief grew smaller in the distance. Ahead lay the unknown territories of California and whatever new life she and Jonas might build together. Clara rode toward that uncertain future with her spine straight and her eyes forward, carrying the memory of Elias like a blessing rather than a burden, ready at last to discover who she might become when she stopped defining herself by what she had lost. They traveled west for 6 days, following established trails that wound through mountain passes still treacherous with late spring snow. The journey tested both their endurance and their growing partnership, requiring them to work together through swollen river crossings, narrow ledges, and nights when the temperature dropped below freezing despite the advancing season. On the 7th day, they crested a ridge and saw spread before them a valley unlike anything Clara had ever imagined, where the Wyoming mountains had been harsh and unforgiving. This California landscape rolled gently toward distant hills, painted in shades of gold and green that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. A stream wound through the valley floor, lined with cottonwoods and willows that showed the fresh green of new growth. "Look there," Jonas said, pointing to a spot where the creek made a lazy curve around a low hill. "Good water, shelter from the wind, high ground in case of flooding. A man could build something lasting there." Clara studied the site he indicated, seeing what he saw, a place where a home could be built, where gardens could be planted. where two people could start fresh without the weight of past judgments. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But does anyone own it?" Jonas pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag, a claim document he had purchased in the last town they had passed through. "As of 3 days ago, we do. Filed a homestead claim for 160 acres, right where that creek bends." Clara stared at him, stunned. "We? Jonas, you can't just..." "Can't just what? Plan a future with the woman I love?" Jonas's voice was gentle but firm. "Clara, I know this is moving fast, but we've been through enough together to know what we mean to each other. I want to build something with you, something that belongs to both of us." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked from Jonas to the valley spread below them. For so long, her future had been something she couldn't imagine, a blank space beyond the next day's survival. Now, suddenly, she could see it, a house by the creek, gardens green with vegetables, perhaps children playing in the yard while she and Jonas grew old together. "What about my letter?" she asked. "What about justice for Elias?" Jonas reached into his own saddlebag and pulled out an envelope addressed to the territorial governor in Denver. "Already taken care of. Mailed it from the last town, along with copies to a newspaper editor and a federal marshal. Whatever comes of it, the truth is out there now." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a weight she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. "You think anything will come of it?" "I think the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when powerful men get careless," Jonas replied. "But even if nothing happens, you've done what you could. You've honored Elias's memory and cleared your conscience." They made camp that night on their new land, building a fire near the creek and sharing a meal while the sun set behind the rolling hills. Clara found herself planning aloud, where the house should sit to catch the morning sun, where the barn could be built to shelter animals, how they could divert water from the creek to irrigate crops. "Listen to yourself," Jonas said with a smile. "You sound like a woman with a future." Clara paused, considering his words. "I suppose I do. When did that happen?" "Sometime between standing up to Garrison and trusting me enough to come this far." Jonas reached for her hand across the small space between them. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no wrong answer." Clara felt her heart begin to race. "What is it?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he looked up, his pale eyes were serious but warm. "Will you marry me? Not because you have to, not because it's expected, but because you want to build a life with me." Clara had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like weather over the mountains, but hearing the actual words still made her breath catch. "Jonas," she said carefully, "you know I'll never stop loving Elias. He'll always be part of who I am." "I know," Jonas replied. "I wouldn't want you to stop loving him. What you had with Elias, that's not something I'm competing with. What I'm asking for is different, not instead of what you had, but alongside it." Clara looked at this man who had wandered out of a blizzard wearing her dead lover's coat, who had brought her both closure and the possibility of new beginnings. He understood her in ways she hadn't thought possible, accepted all the complicated parts of her heart without asking her to choose between past and future. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jonas smiled, the first completely unguarded expression of joy she had ever seen from him. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a simple gold band, his grandmother's ring. He explained, the only valuable thing he had left from his life before loss taught him what truly mattered. Clara held out her hand, letting him slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for her to claim it. They were married 3 weeks later in the small town of Riverside, 20 miles south of their homestead. The ceremony was simple. A territorial judge, 2 witnesses borrowed from the general store, vows spoken in a parlor that smelled of dust and leather-bound law books. Clara wore her blue wool dress, the same one she had worn when confronting Garrison, and carried wildflowers that Jonas had picked that morning from the meadows near their creek. She felt Elias's presence during the ceremony, not as a weight or a shadow, but as a blessing. as if he approved of her choice to keep living, to keep loving. The summer that followed was a time of building, both literally and figuratively. They constructed a modest house from lumber cut in the nearby foothills, with a wide front porch that faced the creek and windows positioned to catch both morning and evening light. Clara planted a garden with vegetables and herbs, while Jonas built corrals and a barn for the livestock they planned to acquire. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the hills, planning their future and sharing stories from their pasts. Clara told Jonas about her childhood in Missouri, about the books she had loved and the dreams she had harbored before love and loss taught her that life rarely followed expected paths. Jonas spoke of his years wandering after his family's death, of the towns he had passed through and the jobs he had worked while searching for something he couldn't name. "What were you looking for all those years?" Clara asked one evening as they watched fireflies begin to blink among the creek willows. Jonas was quiet for a moment, considering. "Peace, I thought, but I think what I was really looking for was home. Not a place, but the feeling of belonging somewhere, with someone." Clara reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of people who had learned to fit their lives together. "Have you found it?" Jonas looked at her in the soft light of evening, seeing the woman who had emerged from grief and fear to build something new. "Yes," he said simply. "I found it with you." As autumn approached, Clara received a letter that made her hands shake as she opened it. The territorial governor's office was investigating allegations of corruption and misconduct among law enforcement officials in the Bitter Creek area. Deputy Frank Garrison had been suspended pending a full inquiry into his conduct, including possible involvement in the death of Elias Redhawk. Clara read the letter twice, then handed it to Jonas without a word. When he finished reading, he looked up to find tears streaming down her face. "Justice," she whispered. "Finally, justice for Elias." Jonas pulled her into his arms, holding her as she wept, not tears of grief this time, but tears of release, of a burden finally lifted after years of carrying it alone. "He can rest now," Clara said when she could speak again, "and so can I." That night, they made love with a tenderness that felt like ceremony, like a final laying to rest of old sorrows and a celebration of new possibilities. Clara felt something shift inside her, the last piece of her heart that had been locked away since Elias's death finally opening to the light. Winter came gently to their valley, bringing soft snows that dusted the hills and sent the creek singing with fresh snowmelt. Clara found herself pregnant as the new year began, carrying within her body the promise of a future that would honor the past while embracing what was yet to come. On a clear night in February, exactly 1 year after Jonas had stumbled through her door wearing Elias's coat, Clara stood on their porch and looked up at the stars. Jonas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his hands on her growing belly. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Clara leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling their child move within her, surrounded by the life they had built together on land that belonged to them both. In the distance, she could hear the creek murmuring its constant song, and overhead, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had shone down on her and Elias in their mountain cabin, the same stars that would shine on whatever came next. "I loved 2 men in my life," she said finally. "One taught me that love was possible. The other taught me that love was infinite, that the heart doesn't replace what it has lost, but finds room for what it needs." Jonas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And what do you need now?" Clara smiled, placing her hands over his on her belly, feeling the flutter of new life beneath their joined palms. "This," she said simply. "All of this. The past that made me who I am, the present that gives me joy, and the future that stretches out before us like an open road." Behind them, their house glowed with warm lamplight, filled with books and furniture and the comfortable accumulation of a shared life. Ahead of them lay all the tomorrows they would build together, season by season, year by year, anchored by love that was large enough to hold both memory and hope. Clara Whitmore Mercer closed her eyes and listened to her husband's breathing, to the sound of water over stones, to the vast silence of the western night that no longer felt empty but full of promise. She had survived the loss of her first love and found the courage to embrace a second. She had faced down the men who had tried to diminish her and emerged stronger. She had learned that the heart could break and heal and love again, deeper and wiser than before. The stars wheeled overhead, and the creek sang its eternal song. And Clara stood in her husband's arms and felt grateful for every step of the journey that had brought her to this moment, this place, this life that was finally, completely, her own. Thank you for listening to Clara and Jonas's story here around our campfire tonight. Their journey from grief to healing, from isolation to love, reminds us that even in our darkest winters, spring will come again. I'd love to hear where you're listening to this tale. Are you by your own fireside? Perhaps walking under the stars? Or maybe dreaming of wide western skies? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love and redemption from the frontier. And share your thoughts about Clara's courage to love again after loss. Until we meet again around the campfire, may your trails be safe and your hearts be open to whatever tomorrow may bring.